Hi everyone, this is Cathy with Parents for FAPE, and today is part 3 of our series on discipline. Now, if you haven't had a chance to watch part 1 and part 2, I'd highly encourage you to go and look back on our Facebook page, facebook.com/parentsforfape, or our YouTube channel, so that you can be familiar with the information. Part 1, we went over what exactly is zero tolerance and high exclusionary discipline practices. And the second part, we went through a lot of the unfortunate side effects of using that kind of discipline, and also what it does to kids who aren't being disciplined in the school and how it affects them and lowers their reading and math scores by being in an environment where high use of suspensions and expulsions is being utilized as a way of controlling students' behavior. So if you haven't had a chance, go back and watch those. But today we're going to talk about the the cost of suspensions for the kids who are being suspended or expelled from school. And they're kind of difficult things to talk about. So I wanted to make sure that this part was shorter and a little bit more impactful for everybody and understanding exactly what's going on. So we're looking at some of the consequences of that use of high suspension on the students who are experiencing the exclusionary discipline practices. There's a lot of studies on it, and you can look at the Vera Institute for more links to other studies if you want to learn more. But this particular study really stood out for me. And this is about the consequence, or what happens with the dropout rate the more suspensions a kid experiences. So these researchers looked at a school division in Florida, and they only used first-time ninth graders. So someone who had to repeat the class was not included in this. And they really found that the overall suspension rate increased dramatically the more suspensions you have. And remember, these suspensions may be for small things. Remember, we talked about in the first part of the series, we were talking about things like insubordination or bringing a toy to school that looks like a gun or looks like it could be a weapon. Remember when we talked about the issues with the way, because zero tolerance can't consider mitigating circumstances, they can't consider the context things were in. So a butter knife is the same thing as a switchblade. A app that sounds like bullets going is the same as bringing a gun. Those, so they can't consider the context it's in. Even though some people will, and we've covered that in other parts of it where it can be unfortunately manipulated in a certain way accidentally by educators. So remember, these are not suspensions of these are just bad kids. They may just be something little. It could be they accidentally scratched another kid with a pencil, or they could have been defending themselves in a situation where they were being bullied and they fought back, and then that results in a suspension. So when you get one suspension, it doubles your risk of dropping out, and you may have just been defending yourself from a bullying situation. So when people look at these numbers and they say, oh, suspension, the kid wouldn't get suspended unless they were a really bad kid, that's not necessarily true. Because remember from our first video, when we look at the actual reasons for suspending kids, a lot of times it could require just some education instead of sending them out of school. Or they may be relatively minor things. So keep that in mind, because there are people kind of assume that it's these big egregious things, and sometimes it's not so much that. So the cost of dropping out. So this is also hard for people to understand, because it's also, we look at this is not somebody specific we're thinking about. So it's hard to kind of consider this in the context of your community. But students experiencing out-of-school suspension face higher rates of unemployment, underemployment. Underemployment means, like, if you have a master's degree in project management and you're working as flipping burgers at McDonald's, that's underemployment. Or incarceration, which is going to prison. The high school dropouts are 72% more likely to become unemployed as compared to their peers, as their high school graduate peers. And then the arrest rate for special education students was significantly higher than those who had graduated. Now, remember, we talk, because of course Parents for FAPE is more focused on students who are dealing with disabilities, and a lot of those disabilities don't necessarily get identified. You have emotional disturbance, which is one of the categories under IDEA for disability, and those kids can't control what they're going through, and it could be from trauma, it could be from PTSD, could be from previous thing in school. They could be bullied. There's a lot of reasons why kids with disabilities don't necessarily get identified, especially if they it's an invisible disability where it's not like you can look at them and say, oh yeah, that child has autism, that child has ADHD, that child has emotional disturbance. So it can be kind of hard, and sometimes it's very hard for people without the training, without evaluations, to understand if this kid has a disability. And of course, if no one considers if the child could have a disability when they're just looking at behavior and they just think it's behavior, they're not necessarily going to send them to be referred for evaluation under IDEA, even though behavior alone can be the sole reason for trying to seek IDEA evaluation and provide students the ability to find out what's going on with them and intervene. But they may not end up there because they might just be labeled a bad kid when really it's an invisible disability. The cumulative, when you're talking about kids who have dropped out, in the 3 to 5 years after dropping out, the cumulative arrest rate for youth with serious emotional disturbance was 73%. And like I said, emotional disturbance is a category under IDEA. And those are students who need to be receiving services in a lot of these cases. So when you're talking about 73% of these kids in this one category, how much could we have intervened before to help these students? And behavior is one of those things that should tell us that we should be intervening with these kids and not just throwing them out of school, because then they don't get help at all, definitely. More than 80% of the students who are incarcerated are high school, or the people who are in jail right now are incarcerated, are high school dropouts. And that's a huge number. You think about it, your basic education, getting a high school diploma, you need at least that for a lot of jobs. You can't necessarily work as a firefighter. You can't work in billing. A lot of times, there's a lot of jobs that you cannot work if you don't have that piece of paper. And sometimes you can get the GEDs, but that is not the same as a high school diploma, and it's not perceived as such. So in the literacy project looked also at this. We're saying 80% of incarcerated high school of those incarcerated are high school dropouts. They found that 3 out of 5 of prison inmates are illiterate. 85% of juvenile offenders have trouble reading, and some show illiteracy rates in some of the studies as high as 75% in these prisons. And in this day and age, if you can't read, there are very, very, very few jobs that are available. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, you could still work as a mechanic because cars were mostly mechanical. Now they're more computerized, and you have to be able to read these charts and find all those things. You have to go to school for it and get your certifications. To become a plumber, you have to be able to know what part. The last time I hired a plumber, everything was digital, so they had to mark what parts they needed and write up an estimate. And so kids who can't read when they're dropping out of school, there's no real place for them in the job market. No real good places for them, and they sometimes don't have options, it seems, in their lives for something other than violating the law. And they may have to violate the law to survive. So when we think about this, the average cost of incarcerating an inmate every year in Virginia is $21,299. And for a child to drop out of school legally, they have to be at least 16. Now remember, this is a student coming into school at the age of 5, typically. So if we go by that and we look at the typical time period, we're talking about a little more than a decade that a student would be in a classroom and receive services, and in theory would learn how to read. So if a child can't learn how to read from kindergarten to approximately 10th grade, 9th or 10th grade, that's a problem if they've been able to carry all the way through there. And I don't know about you, but when I see that $21,000 amount for paying for an inmate per year, I would rather more money be spent on teaching our kids how to read than to spend that money in a prison setting. And then those kids can be contributing members of society. And so rarely, though, when we talk about high suspension rates, we don't talk about the collateral damage. Like in this video number 2, part 2, we talked about the anxiety, the difficulty that kids have in just being in a high suspension environment, even though they're not the ones being disciplined. But we really need to look at what the cost of suspension is costing our community. So the higher risk of incarceration means more people in prison, and then we spend $21,299 per inmate per year. Those are out of our tax dollars. Underemployment or unemployment means lower tax revenue. So if you want to pay for flooding mitigation, you want to pay for new roads. When you have people who are not making what they should be making because they can't read, because they were dropped out of school, because they were suspended for things that may or may not have been necessary for suspension. Sometimes suspension is necessary, but not all, and a lot of times it isn't. But they're not adding into that pool of money that pays for the incarceration costs. So you have less tax revenue to pay for the jails, to pay for roads, to pay for resources that you need. Reduced interventions for those with identified and unidentified disabilities. Imagine if you don't identify a student as having a disability, then they don't get the help they need to maximize their potential in the formative years and the first 18 years of their lives when they're interacting with the public school system, then there's going to be a higher burden on community resources. It may be social services, it may be the police, it may be the firefighters, it could be ambulances, emergency rooms, social workers, Medicaid, Medicare, all of those things may have to take and may require more funding to just bring people up to a basic level. And I know when we're talking about this is all theoretical, so sometimes it's very hard for people to understand that. That we're not talking about a particular person, but these are people and these are our neighbors. And these could be people on your block, no matter how nice your neighborhood is. And then there's the emotional cost of distrust of law enforcement, which we cannot measure. And if you remember in the previous videos, we talked about how school resource officers are sometimes being used inappropriately by school personnel in order for them to in order for them to deal with behavior issues with kids with disabilities or kids who are struggling with a lot of things. If you think about it, there's a lot of kids who they don't want to be thought of as not being able to read, so they might become a behavior problem because that seems like the socially more accepted way to be put down almost. So there are kids who start misbehaving when they're about to be tasked with something they're not able to do. And we focus on the behavior problem, we miss the reading problem underneath that's actually causing everything. But when we talked about it before, the school resource officer, one of my kids was shutting down in class. I witnessed another student shutting down in class, and in both cases, the school resource officer was used as a threat to that student to get them to comply when they were clearly having an issue with their disability getting in the way, and they needed a moment. And neither were being violent, neither were being disruptive. It was just simply they were shutting down and unable to truly focus on the classroom. So I know this is difficult. It's a very difficult and theoretical subject to look at. And in our society, we really push the control-based disciplines. Oh, well, they should do what they're told. You should be heavy-handed with discipline. And we tend to say, oh, it's the parents' fault. Or it's, we don't take responsibility for a problem that's becoming increasingly bigger and bigger every year, and we don't think about how we can reverse the trend. You look at the school shootings, and in some of those cases, it's been related to kids who are trying to get resources and they weren't getting them. Now, that's not going to be, it's unfair to think that mental illness or lack of resources for disabilities, that those kids are more likely to become violent. But if you think about the way we're doing it, if you're being bullied, you cannot fight back or you're going to get suspended. And if you get suspended because you fought back with that bully and they keep pushing you, keep pushing you, and keep pushing you, and then you keep getting suspended, do you feel like the school's got your back? Do you feel like the community's got your back? And for all of our talk about caring about people who are being bullied, we tend to not actually do anything about it. We sit back and watch this when it's happening, and then when it breaks the news, we say, oh, that's so horrible. Why didn't people step in? Well, it's the same reason why so many people in the community don't step in. This is happening in your neighborhood. It's happening at your child's school. It's happening at your grandchild's school. It is happening all over the country, and there is no school and there is no community that is not being affected by this problem. So next time will be part 4, and we will discuss some groups, how some groups appear to have more suspensions than other groups and what might be causing the discrepancy. This can be a little bit of a difficult topic because we're going to be covering racism and we're going to be covering disabilities. But I hope you keep an open mind to all these things, because this, without the education of this, without understanding what's going on, you can't really know how to solve it unless we're all informed about what the issues are. So thank you for listening today. Hope you have time to go visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/parentsforfape, or our YouTube channel called Parents for FAPE. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email us at parentsforfape@gmail.com or comment on this thread. Thank you for listening. Bye.